So we've created our own user service exception, and we have thrown this exception if one of the required fields is empty. And this was just an example. Let's now learn how to handle this specific user service exception so that if needed, we can do something different about this error scenario. So to handle exceptions in our RESTful web services application built with Spring Boot and Spring MVC, I will create a new class inside of exceptions. And I will call it app exceptions handler, like this. I'll click on finish. And for this class to be able to handle exceptions, it will need to have a couple of special annotations. And the very first annotation is called controller advice. So I will annotate the class itself with controller advice. So now it should have a method that will be used to handle exception, and the type of exception that this method can handle will provide using the annotation as well. So I'll create a method, and it's going to be public method, and it needs to return a response entity, and that is going to be a generic. And the name of the method can be any. I will call it handle user service exception, because I'm creating this particular method to handle a user service exception, the custom exception we have created. And this method will accept two arguments. The first argument is the exception that we need to handle. So that's going to be user service exception. And the second argument is of web request data type. It gives us access to HTTP request, and we can access cookies and headers and request parameters and so on. So it's web request, and I will call it request, like this. So now let me import response entity, and let me import a web request. Okay, and this method needs to return response entity. So let us return new response entity, and that response entity takes a few parameters. First is the error message description. So we have exception object here, so I'll use exception get message. Then I will give it HTTP headers, just an empty object. And the next one, HTTP status, and here we can select one of the HTTP status codes that we want to return with this response. At this time I will select a general internal server error, and will import HTTP headers. Cannot find it, maybe this one has to be HTTP lowercase. Let's try again. Okay, and finally we will need to annotate this method with the special annotation that is configured to handle our user service exception. So we will use that special annotation, and it's called exception handler annotation. And this exception handler annotation takes in value, and we can provide one or more exceptions that this method is responsible to handle. Well, at this moment I'm configuring it to handle a single exception. This is why I'm going to provide user service exception here. But we could configure this method to handle more than one exceptions. So I will now import exception handler. And this is it. We have our exception handler method ready. This method again is responsible for handling only one user service exception, and we can put a breakpoint here to see if it gets triggered when we throw a user service exception. And we do throw user service exception currently inside of our REST controller create user method here if one of the required fields is empty. So let's save our work, let's restart our application, and let's see if it worked. So I will start up my application in debug mode. Okay, my application is up and running. I'll bring up Postman, and I will send this request, which should trigger an exception because one of the required fields is empty. So I will send this. And we have a request to open a debug perspective. I'll say yes. And here we go. Our controller advice class is in display, and we have the exception handler for this user service exception. So we're able to catch that exception, and if needed, we can do something different about this exception. So let's resume our debugging. Let's go into Postman and see what was the response. And we've got unexpected a very confusing response message. But this is most likely because it is unexpected media type. Let's look at the headers. We are accepting JSON, yes, but we're getting back a string value of the error message. So if I go back to my Sprint Suite, here as a response entity, we are returning not an object, but a description of that error message, which is a plain string. Let's go back into our Postman, and let's, after we have disabled the accept header, let's repeat this request. And again, we got the breakpoint triggered. I'll simply play it and go back to my Postman. Yes, and here we get missing required field, a description of that error message. So as you can see, after handling this exception, we can do something different. We can either return same JSON representation of error message, or we can return a custom one. So for example, if I wanted to return a custom, I would provide here a custom object, and that object will be converted into JSON or XML depending on the headers provided in the request, or it can be a string value, or it can be entire exception. So let's change it to exception, save this one, and repeat our request. Our breakpoint, I'll resume it and have a look at the response.